and you can send it out to people that way. So we will just go ahead and start going through. So what I wanted to talk to all of you about today was the importance of roadsides for bird conservation and how disrupting those roadsides, especially with pesticides, can be really detrimental. So American Bird Conservancy, just a little more about us. We do work to conserve birds across the Americas, so North and South America, and it's a really good combination of field work, policy, and advocacy, which is what I do, so working in the legislative sphere, addressing direct threats to birds from glass collisions, domestic cats. We do a lot of outreach and awareness work, and we also operate an international reserve network. So we own a decent amount of property that we operate as conservation reserves for birds to go to, because we focus on a bird's entire life cycle. We want to know where they are during their breeding season. We want to know how they get to and from there in their wintering grounds, and we want a safe space to go to. So about 3 years ago, there was a paper published called Decline of the North American Avifauna, and it had a ton of different authors. The American Bird Conservancy president, Mike Barr, was one of them, and it cataloged the immense loss of birds that was being experienced worldwide. And just to put it in a little bit of context, when I say loss of birds, I'm not lost a handful of species. There are currently 3 billion fewer birds in North America than there should be. And what that looks like is about 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. And sure, every year there's a little bit of fluctuation where we lose a handful of birds to this particular threat or that particular threat. There's normal population ups and downs. But I'm saying that at wood feeders this summer, 1 in 4 birds that shy of the different factors, one of which, or 2 of which, are habitat loss, especially in grassland areas, and pesticide contamination. Grassland birds were actually the most heavily impacted broad group of birds. We have lost 720 million, 53%. So old species that we like to look at is the eastern meadowlark as well as the western meadowlark, their western counterpart. And meadowlarks are a really good indicator because they tend to hang out a lot of grasslands. They eat a ton of insects, both native and invasive. So a loss in this group of birds is particularly impactful. And when I say grassland birds, this is the part of the country that we are talking about. So this is kind of their northern, their breeding range, and then all the way down here to the south. And you can see that Wisconsin is a very important part of that equation. There are a lot of birds that will summer in Wisconsin. Thing that this plays, it may not with the internet speed, and that's fine. But one thing that I do want to illustrate is what a bird's migration pattern looks like. This is for a barn swallow. And you can see as we get more heavily purple, that means more birds. And what they do is they really go all the way up into North America, and then they filter all the way back down into South America. I'm going to play that one more time, because I want you to notice, it's not that, they pop up in South America and then they very quickly reappear in North America and go back. There's actually a lot of overlap time in these stopover areas that they will use along the way. One of which are the northern United States. And this is where roadsides come into play for a lot of different bird species. Roadside habitats are respite for a lot of different birds. It's thought that in Minnesota, as much as 25% of the ringneck pheasant population does all of their breeding in roadside habitats. They hold incredible biodiversity between reptiles like snakes and turtles, hundreds of different species of birds, thousands of different species of native plant and insect, a lot of different soil microbiota. They can connect existing habitats, so we use roads as actual highways, but a lot of wildlife will also use roadside pieces of habitat Those are called habitat corridors, if anyone's not familiar. And they are really important nesting grounds for game birds. So when you start talking about bird conservation, it's very easy for people to immediately get into the mindset of just the pretty little colorful ones that people are sitting there looking at with their binoculars, and the hunting community gets marginalized. And that's not at all what we do at American Bird Conservancy. We see birds not only as having intrinsic value and as great pollinators, but also their importance as a game species can't be ignored. We do a lot of work with the Wild Turkey Federation, Quails Forever, Pheasants Forever. We have great relationships with a lot of the sporting community. And roadside habitats are particularly important for a lot of game birds such as quails, doves, partridges, and certainly turkey and pheasant. So you can see from this graphic here, this was pulled out of a Kroger et al. Paper from the mid-2000s, and it looked at roadsides and bird species richness. And basically what they found is if you look at an undisturbed habitat, so a big open field or prairie, it has basically the same amount of species richness as a roadside habitat. So roadsides can be really well adapted. They can support an incredibly high array of species, everything from scavenging birds and raptors, such as corvids, crows and jays, hawks, eagles, vultures, you name it, all the way down to omnivores and other passerines, such as meadowlarks, swallows, hummingbirds even, you name it. They can provide a lot of really, really important habitat. And so when we hear all of these things, we start to think, okay, well, if it's so great for birds and wildlife and it's nice to look at, why is it that we even treat roadsides with pesticides? And mowing and pesticides are the two most common applications for pest control along roadsides. And frankly, it's because they're easily accessible. It's a lot easier to be driving down a highway and driving down a roadside and use a big broad spectrum spray vehicle like this and just pump out a lot of chemicals to kill weeds. Sometimes it's invasive species. So there are certainly reasons why people do it. However, why we do it is what we really need to think about. What's the ultimate goal? Why am I using the chemicals that I'm choosing to? How often am I mowing? All of these things need to be brought into question. And especially when we're applying broad spectrum pesticides, we see the double trouble effect on birds. This is where I get the title of my presentation. There is a dual effect that birds experience from pesticides, both directly being exposed to them, which can include ingesting pesticides, dermal or inhalation where it gets on their skin or they might breathe it in, interaction with plants or animals that might have also gotten sprayed by these chemicals, and then also the wider environmental impacts. Up to 67 million birds are lost to pesticides every year, and that's just pesticides, and that's birds. So you can imagine this number gets much larger when you start to look at a lot of other species. And this is from everything, including agricultural pesticides like seed treatments and sprays on crops, to private uses like gardens, lawns, golf courses, and then of course, the spraying of roadsides as well. And depending on where you are and how your particular county, locality, or even your state regulates it, roadsides can either be under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation, a highway authority, a county authority, sometimes even private landowners. So there are a lot of different interests that need to be balanced. And then when you start to look at the ecosystem impacts of pesticides and how they affect birds, we're looking at the effects that chemicals can have on wiping out invertebrate food sources, such as insects, non-target invertebrates such as dragonflies, and then tiny little shrimp and other aquatic invertebrates that a lot of birds will rely on as food sources. There are impacts on the actual habitat itself, so wiping out really important bacteria and other smaller organisms in waterways and forest ecosystems, a lot of that comes into play on roadsides too, because when rain hits roadsides, it washes right off to the side usually. It hits whatever vegetation is there, and if that's been freshly or even not freshly sprayed with pesticides, all of that can get washed downstream and wind up in areas where it was never intended to go, like streams, ponds, lakes, rivers, neighboring prairies, you name it. And then there's also effects on human food as well. So a lot of the pesticides that we might be spraying along roadsides tend to wash off of a lot of those areas and wind up in our farm fields or other drainage areas. And when pesticides are impacting birds, it can, like I said, it's double trouble. It can happen in a variety of different ways. There was a really great study done in the Netherlands where they looked at the use of neonicotinoid insecticides, which are really noxious, really nasty class of chemicals. And what they found was that bird populations were disappearing. They were going down, which is this lower graph here. Up top, this is a map of all the areas where neonicotinoid insecticides were used. And the only thing that explained it was the use of chemicals. And it's not that the birds themselves were being sprayed with the poisons, it's that the bugs were being wiped out. And when there were fewer insects for the birds to eat, they had less to feed their chicks, which meant fewer chicks, which meant that for the next 10 years, they saw an overall decline in the amount of birds that were present in those areas. And all of it is traced back to the use of this insecticide in that area. I'm not gonna go all the way through this graph, or through this infographic, but this just shows that once a chemical gets into the environment, especially into waterways, as it's really prone to do along roadsides, it can really easily cycle through everything and kind of just keep getting recycled back into the environment. And there are better practices available. Rather than just immediately jumping to chemical use, if there is a perceived need to control pests, you can use true integrated pest management, or IPM, and I'm sure this is a term a lot of us are familiar with, but we tend to get away from it a little bit. The modern understanding of integrated pest management talks about having as many different chemicals in your toolbox as possible, and you want to rotate your herbicides, you want to rotate your insecticides so that the target pest does not build up resistance to them. That's not how integrated pest management is supposed to work. Integrated pest management is supposed to leverage natural pest controlling factors such as beneficial insects, such as weather patterns, cycling of the season, timing, natural predators like birds, which can be really great for controlling insects, and then as a last resort, relying on chemicals. And even then, chemicals really should only be relied on when there's a demonstrated need for their use, when you can document and say, we've looked at all of the outcomes and the only thing that's going to work is this chemical, we're going to use it in this very targeted fashion, just a handful of times or maybe only once, and then we'll look again and then it's if this pest is really even present. Especially along the roadsides, it gets very, very easy to get into a pattern of every 3 months we spray for weeds, every 2 months we spray for mosquitoes, every month we're going to spray for ticks, whatever it might be. And while that's efficient and it looks for where it gets really, really tricky is that unless you demonstrated those chemicals, if you break your arm, you're going to go to the doctor and get a cast put on it until it heals. But you're not going to go back to the doctor every 6 months for the rest of your life to get a cast put on because maybe you broke your arm again. You need to demonstrate that there's a risk that needs to be mitigated, fix the problem, and then scout it out again to see if that's even present. So when it comes to managing roadside habitat for birds and making sure that you're doing all that you can, what can you even do? What's available? Number one, ask about spraying. How often is it done with pesticides and other chemicals? Is it somebody that the locality, municipality has contracted in? AKA, did they just say, we needed someone to come in, we hired a company, and then we left it up to them? Or can you interact and ask them, how frequently are you spraying? What are you spraying? Are you demonstrated need for pest control at this time? Put environmental impact studies. These get kicked off a lot, or these get kicked out of projects quite frequently. but there were really important.
Your fingers crossed.
Can you call him?
I've been communicating with him via email, so I would have to go into his email and look, but I can try to do that.
I didn't know that was.
Recording in
Restoring
progress.
native pollinator habitats. And then finally, reducing mowing is really, really important as well. So just putting it off for as long as possible, even though it looks big and overgrown, it can really help. I would also be remiss if I did not mention the Grassland Conservation Act introduced by Ron Wyden of Oregon. S4639. Tell your senators to co-sponsor and vote yes when it does get to committee. It's a really, really great way to put more money and resources into grassland conservation. I don't know if you were able to see the entire presentation, but Lori was kind enough to say that this was recorded. I'm also happy to record it again and send it out. And with that, I will stop and open it up for questions if anyone has any.
Awesome, thank you, Hardy. We were able to hear the majority. You cut out there just for a sec.
Okay.
We will, as you mentioned, we will be sharing the recording and we will be sharing the videos of other presenters throughout the day. So, but that was, for me, you and I talked earlier and you know I'm a huge bird lover, and so that was, again, a little heart-wrenching to see some of those statistics, but I guess that's why we're here today, to figure out what we can do to help and to promote habitat for birds, among other things, pollinators and insects and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, does anyone have a question? Yep, Marie?
I was just, I don't know why we would be spraying for pesticide, why we would spray pesticides here. I think more in our area it's herbicides that get sprayed, because we don't really have a lot of, that I know of, insects by the roads that need to be controlled. The herbicides are more of a, we really struggle with wild parsnip and things like that, and so that, I don't have any thought. I would like there to be as little spraying as possible, also want as little parsnip as possible.
And from my Department of Ag days, I can say that pesticide is the umbrella, so it includes herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, all the sides, all the things that kill living organisms are called pesticides. And Maureen's absolutely right, we don't use insecticides, and the earlier speaker, Hardy, who you couldn't hear, said that we use very little in the way of herbicides, only mainly around, what were they called? Guardrails. Mainly around guardrails.
Yeah.
But I think you're bringing us a national perspective, and I have lived in states, I have been in places where I see those big trucks hosing down the world. And so I think it's a real concern, obviously on a national level. But maybe you want to speak to Maureen's question about herbicide impacts.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and I should have made that clear at the beginning. I apologize. Exactly as I said, when I say pesticide, I mean all of the sides, all of the CIDES. So herbicides are definitely included in that. And yeah, that's fantastic. If they're only being used around guardrails, honestly, that's exactly how they should be used. In a highly targeted fashion. But with species such as wild parsnip, garlic mustard is another one, honeysuckle, of course. It's less about the amount of when that you're applying in some cases, and more about when. And so herbicide can be used to combat those things, but it can only be applied effectively at certain times of the year. Depending on the plant, it can be when they're fruiting, it can be when they're taking up seed, it can be when they're just shooting at the beginning of the season. And so knowing when to use the right chemicals is just as important as knowing what chemicals to use, period. So if you have an area that might be treated regularly for wild parsnip, for honeysuckle, for garlic mustard, for kudzu in the south, whatever it could be, it's going to be a lot less effective sometimes. It's not really going to do much unless you're hitting it at the right point in that plant's life cycle. I'm not at all saying that it's being done incorrectly in Wisconsin or wherever you may live, but like Laura said, talking a national thing, it's very easy to put these things on a schedule and attack a problem without knowing exactly what that problem is. There's also something to be said for making sure that the label for a pesticide is being read. And I mean, sometimes it's as easy as making sure that you're not applying herbicide before or after a rainstorm, cutting down on any exposure to water, or if it's a particularly hot day, you want to do it earlier, or you want to do it in the middle of the day when it's going to dry up quickly, and not in the morning or the evening when bees are going to be more active. So scheduling can be just as important as well as the type of chemical that you're using. But really, really fantastic point, and thank you, Lori, for clarifying. Yeah, I'm speaking more from a national perspective, but I got to tell you, everyone, the only places where the real conservation and a lot of the movement is happening is at the state and local level. So being involved with groups like this and talking about this is so important, because this is where the work is being done. Any other questions?
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, we are thrilled that you could join us today, and if you want to hang in, we'll try to keep you on board. We're actually at a break time right now, so you let me know if you want to call back in. I can try to make that happen. Or
yeah, I will. I'll just stay hanging out on the Zoom for as long as I can.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you all.
We're going to take a quick break, and then our next speaker should be here any minute. She was on her way.